Hello, everyone, and welcome to DEIB in the Modern Workplace, a disability perspective with Mason Metzger. Thank you so much for partnering with CWL and taking the time to invest in both your personal and your professional development with us today. Our hopes for this specific fireside chat are that we would all walk away having a greater understanding of our impact on the workplace and knowing how we can both support and initiate DEIB in ourselves and the workplace to evaluate our own biases. Last month, we focused on leadership and diversity, and this month we will continue to deepen our learning around this topic with equitable connections around differences. Mason is here with us today as a wonderful person and an engaging and knowledgeable speaker. And we just know that you'll love him as much as we do. So I'd love to start by telling you a little bit about Mason. Mason Metzger is an award-winning keynote motivational speaker, accessibility advocate, and change agent from Warsaw, Indiana. Mason graduated from Indiana Wesleyan University with a bachelor's degree in communication, emphasizing on organizational leadership in April 2022. Through his experiences in higher education, Mason began to develop an expertise in universal design while simultaneously partnering with various campus units to make higher education and the overall experience more accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Many organizations desire to serve people with disabilities, allowing Mason to serve on various boards and committees in both for-profit and nonprofit settings. Since completing his undergraduate studies, Mason hopes to continue speaking and consulting while aiming to find full-time roles. Mason is currently writing a book that he hopes to self-publish as part of his 5-year plan. The working title is Specialized Challenge, A Journey Towards Contentment. We are so excited to have Mason here with us today to share what he has. And be sure to write down questions to ask after his presentation. We'll do a brief Q&A. So Mason, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. I'd love to first just hear you share about this topic of DEIB from your research and expertise. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing about what DEIB is and why it's important to have disability a part of this conversation.
So I would say that it's important to have diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging as part of this conversation, specifically from a disability standpoint, because people with disabilities are often a marginalized group, and sometimes they're overlooked, even though there's things such as the ADA. The ADA is only the building block of inclusion, and that's why universal design is so important. And I'll share a little bit more about that in my slides. Oh, there we go. Now I can see my slides, so that's good. Um, and so I thought a good place to start our conversation today is to look at the employment rate of people with disabilities compared to non-disabled individuals because October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So if you look at the recent research that talks about the employment rate of people with disabilities and non disabled people, you'll find that 77% of people that are not disabled that are between the ages of 16 and 64 are employed in comparison to, as we can see on the next slide, only 30% of 38% of people with disabilities are employed full time. And so that's why this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging of people with disabilities in our world is so important. And I'm so thankful to be able to share with you today two ways that I think we can increase the inclusion of people with disabilities. So, there we go. So, next slide. Okay, so the first way that I want to share with you all today is to design flexible systems in order to include people with disabilities. And a lot of times, one of my favorite pictures of organizational structure and organizational communication and organizational leadership research is Jenga blocks. Because oftentimes, the organizations in which we operate are hierarchical in nature. And if you remove one of those blocks, it can crumble the entire system. And I think sometimes the hierarchical nature of our organizations can limit the inclusion of people with disabilities. And on the next slide, there's one way that society has tried to include people with disabilities here in America, and it's the ADA. And although there has been 32 years of progress related to the inclusion of people with disabilities as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was implemented into law under President George H.W. Bush in 1990, people with disabilities still remain a marginalized group. And I think one of the primary reasons for this is because of the way that the ADA is interpreted. And this definition of the ADA, which you see on the screen, comes from one of the leading organizations on disability rights in the United States. And I love how inclusive this definition is. And so they, at the ADA National Network, they define the Americans with Disabilities Act as a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. And and so one of the components of the ADA is reasonable accommodations. And I think that's the primary growth opportunity with the ADA because there's a lot of ambiguity associated with what is and what is not a reasonable accommodation. And so, therefore, there's a theory called universal design, which we'll see on the next slide. And universal design really takes it from a compliance mindset to a fully inclusive mindset of people with disabilities. And so, just a really quick background on universal design is universal design was pioneered by an architect with a disability named Ronald Mace, and Ronald Mace developed universal design theory alongside the ADA during the disability rights movement up until his death in the late 1990s. And so other scholars have taken what Ronald Mace started and further developed it. And one of my favorite scholars on universal design is named Cheryl Burgstahler from the University of Washington. And in one of her most recent publications, she defines universal design as the design of products and environments in education and business to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So that is really the heart of designing a flexible system because instead of trying to accommodate for people's needs, if we apply universal design principles, we think about everyone's needs in the environment and design a space and design experiences that meet everyone's needs without having to go through the extra work of creating accommodations in order to be inclusive. So, yeah. And then on the next slide, I came up with three considerations for developing flexible systems. So I would say that a flexible organizational system or even flexible policies within what makes up an organization incorporate stakeholder feedback because the people that know what they need best are the people that you serve, whether you work in education or you work in healthcare or some other aspect of the business landscape. In order to be fully inclusive of people with disabilities and other marginalized groups, it's really important to incorporate feedback from your stakeholders. And then flexible systems also take a proactive approach. And a proactive approach means that we start thinking about what people need before they need it. And so um, being proactive is what leads to full inclusion because we're really focused on what people need and how we can serve them rather than having to react to what's happening around us. If we're proactive, it sets everyone up for success. And then the final characteristic of a flexible system is to have an overall openness to trying new things, because I think too often as leaders we get stuck in a mindset where if it's not broke, don't fix it. But that mindset doesn't lead to innovation that serves people very well if you're just focused on doing things how they've always been done. And then the second way that we can be more inclusive of people with disabilities is to be resilient. And so that's what I'm going to share next. And then I think in order to be resilient, we first have to understand some leadership development concepts. And so the first concept is self-awareness. And in this section, I came up with all the definitions based upon my own life experience and my own lens. So I'll just dive into each definition and then describe how they lead to resilience. So, first, self awareness is an individual's ability to recognize their dislikes, strengths, vulnerabilities, and other individual characteristics to positively influence and impact the world around them. And then the next concept I would like to share with you is on the next slide, and it is margin. And I would say that margin is the most significant leadership development concept I've ever learned, and it's transformed the way that I prioritize my life to be able to respond to the needs of the people and organizations around me. And so I defined margin as a conscious effort to incorporate self-care, reflection time, and other priorities into the rhythm of our daily lives to avoid burnout. Because if we don't start to develop self-awareness skills and margin within the rhythm of our daily life, then the likely outcome is burnout. And so, and then the next concept I want to share briefly is endurance. And so I defined endurance as the ability to continue moving toward the objectives or measures you have set for yourself or your team at a sustainable pace, even when presented with limited options and resources. And I know throughout my diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging journey, I've definitely felt like I've been in a fog at certain moments, but it's really important to be able to um, push through the fog and really focus on your mission and what you aim to accomplish in life. And then the final definition is resilience. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these concepts that I just shared really build up to being resilient. So I define resilience as a recognition that there is value embedded within each and every moment of life that we can use to design, create, and deliver inclusive experiences regardless of the circumstances, informed by the experiences in our rear view mirror. And I really like this photo of a mountain on the screen and the rear view mirror, because we have to have a vision in order to see where we're going in our field of view, but our past can also inform how we go about incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the future. And so, just to kind of wrap up this this part of our time together, just a few concluding thoughts. And so, in order to design flexible systems and be resilient, you have to be adaptable because the ability to adapt allows you to continue to serve the needs of people, even if some people's needs are different than others. And really, there's not a cookie cutter way to serve people's needs, and so that's why the ability to adapt is so crucial. And then secondly, it's important to proactively identify growth opportunities and really focus on which investments in our diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging initiatives, whether it be in the built environment or from a policy standpoint, are going to benefit the most amount of people. And in this case, we're talking about which initiatives and which things in the built environment would benefit people with disabilities the most. And then finally, and most importantly, resilience is the key to creating a lasting legacy. And I hope that my comments today inspired you to create and design flexible systems within your organizations and teach your teams the importance of resilience, even when presented with scarce resources or limited options. I thank you so much, and now we will move into a fireside chat, and then after that, I will take questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mason. I think your expertise combined with your experience really brings a really beautiful perspective to this topic that I don't think most of us have heard before. I think we see DEIB work as, here's a leadership thing we need to check off the box in order to make sure that, we're doing this and we're incorporating these things into our businesses and our organizations. But to bring the humanness into this conversation, I think, is what makes it so valuable and makes what you bring to this CWL event so important. So thank you so much for sharing. There's some really beautiful questions and comments for you in the chat. So we'll definitely save those and send them to you so you can continue to read them. But as we move into the fireside chat, I welcome you all to, as Nikki just did, to put questions in the chat about what you have for Mason as we're speaking today. What do you want to know from him and his experience? Maybe specific things about his definitions that he talked about earlier. We would love to see those come up in the chat. But we'll start with a few that we want to make sure that we cover here today and get going there. So without further ado, Mason, what are some of the barriers that you personally have faced when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Okay, thank you so much. I will. So I would say that, and sorry, it looks like my camera might be going in and out, but I think my audio is still working. But I would say that when it comes to the barriers that I faced pertaining to DEIB, I would say that one of the primary barriers is, as a person with a physical disability who requires care assistance and things like that, within the systems that are designed to support people with physical disabilities, there's a lot of bureaucracy that makes it really hard to access resources. So that is definitely one of the barriers, because as we can see from my talk today, I have so much to contribute to places, but the fact that I require a little bit more assistance in order to live my daily life can sometimes be a barrier to positively making a positive impact. But I would definitely say that COVID-19 was a great equalizer for people with disabilities because it opened the door um, for more engagement this way, so I can set up my environment the way that I need it, like having access to a private bathroom is something that it's really hard to put into certain organizations. It's even hard to find gender neutral bathrooms in like hospitals and other settings. And a gender neutral bathroom is something that I need to be able to show up and to be able to do what I do. So that's just one example.
Yeah, thank you for also sharing about the ways that you can overcome those barriers. I'm curious to know, are there any other ways that you feel that people should know how you overcome barriers in the workplace?
I think one of the primary ways that we overcome barriers in the workplace is by by having people like me share our share our experiences, and my experience don't represent the whole community as a whole, because the other thing to keep in mind is there's so much variation in terms of the needs of people with disabilities. So it's really important to ask the people that you serve what they need and to incorporate their feedback into the design and delivery of systems and services. And I think it's also really important for people with disabilities to be sitting at the table where the decisions that are made affect them, so that they can speak their perspective into the design and delivery of services. And that's why it's such a privilege for me to be able to sit on boards and committees to incorporate a person with a physical disabilities feedback into the design and delivery of systems and services within organizations. So yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Mason. I think the key here is that you shared is that people, every person needs something different. And that's why it's important to collect voices that are going to be able to contribute at the table, with the experiences and the things that will most impact them. So yeah, thanks again for sharing your experiences. I hope today that we are all able to really soak it up and really apply what you're saying into our workplaces and how we can translate those things best. Next question is, what are some things that you experience that most able-bodied people wouldn't know?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of examples I could pull for that one, but I was recently doing some consulting for a children's zoo in my area, and the experiences at the zoo really highlighted um how so basically, I'll keep this story short, but basically, I was working with a team of able-bodied individuals on a project to increase the accessibility of the zoo for employees and guests with disabilities. And as part of that project, we did 2 site visits to examine ADA compliance and areas where we could apply universal design principles. And it was really cool to see how my teammates asked me what would be a barrier. So for example, a barrier could be like the weight of a door or the height of something on a counter. And so it was really interesting to see how my teammates started to take on my lens as we were moving through the environment. But I would say one of the most important ways to include the people with disabilities is to have accessibility buttons at your businesses, and then to educate your staff and your people that are in your organization on the purpose of accessibility buttons, because accessibility buttons are an example of something that literally and figuratively opens the doors for people with mobility issues. And that was one of the most remarkable experiences of being a student at IWU, because I could actually open the door for someone else and let them walk through first, which was a really awesome experience.
Yeah, I like that you said that you highlighted your experience too, and didn't try to share specifically for what everybody else would need, but what you need. I think, Mason, you do an excellent job of leading by example, and that's why it's so valuable to listen to you and to hear this talk. Our next question is, what language would you say is important to use when talking about disabilities and talking to people with disabilities?
So, inclusive language is a really vital topic surrounding DEIB, and I would say, in terms of language, it's debated among people with disabilities in our community, because some people prefer person first language, which would be like Mason has a disability, and other people don't really care if it's person first language. But I would always say, from my perspective as a consultant, it's better to default to person first language, because the disability is only a part of someone. It doesn't actually make up their entire identity. And so that's also something that's important to take away, I would say.
Yeah, that's excellent. Person first language. And there's a lot of research and information about that too. So I would encourage you guys, if you're curious to know more about what inclusive language is, we can for sure reach out to Mason if you have questions, and reach out to us too. We'll also have more resources in our newsletter next month. Next question, what do you think leaders can do to remove stigma and biases for people with visual disabilities?
Oh, that's a good question. So, um, I would say, particularly for people with visual disabilities, and there's a lot of the spectrum of visual disability is really wide. And so one of the things that I think of off the top of my head is to look at your signage and see what, if there's braille on the signage. And then I would also say that for some people it can be really helpful to have high contrast items. So because if there's a high contrast sign, it makes it more easy to navigate an environment. And then also, like if you're working in a business that has product displays, it would be really cool to be able to offer an audio option of what is being described by the item, because that allows people with visual impairments to access it. So those are three things that come to my mind when serving people with visual impairments.
Yeah, I love what Dr. Resendez put in the chat. She said it's also important to create awareness to others that are able-bodied to not abuse the accessibility buttons. Mason has shared with her that the cost of repairs and the barriers it creates for individuals that depend on these accessibility buttons. Do you have anything else to add to that, Mason?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that uh, teaching people to be able to know what the purpose of accessibility buttons is really important, because if people just use them for fun, then the repair cost goes up. And especially in light of COVID-19, it's really hard to gain access to parts. And so during my time at IWU, when I spoke for Disability Awareness Month in Chapel, I really emphasized the the role of accessibility buttons and who they're designed for, because sometimes I would see kids like, or not kids because they're college students, but I would see college students like kick the button, and that would that would kind of make me frustrated, because if people are kicking it to open it, that has the potential to damage it. So it's just really important to teach people what those buttons are designed for and how they're a part of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yeah, I think too, Mason, there's been times where I will use the accessibility button just to hold the door open while I'm carrying things inside, or to so that I don't have to wait for somebody behind me to come in through the door, but I want to still be kind and hold the door open. But even that is not the intended use of the button. So I think raising the awareness of why we use accessibility features is really important to make sure that it's available when people who need it are needing to use it. So that's a great point. I guess that kind of moves us into our next question, but how will we best be able to support this movement?
So I would say the best way to support this movement, like a tactical a tactical way to support people with disabilities, is to go back into your organizations and share with the leaders in your organizations what you learned today. But in general, I would say that the best way to support people with disabilities is to ask them what they need, ask them to share their experiences, and provide them ways to be in leadership positions, so that they can shape the way our organizations function in the present and going into the future.
That's fantastic. I think something else I noticed that you did earlier today, again, by demonstrating how we can be more inclusive in our language and in our presentations, is you put image captions on your slides. And that's something for sure, I think that CWL at least is going to adapt and change in our systems and processes. But can you share a little bit about why something like this is so important?
Yeah, so putting captions on your slides for your images, it's a form of what's called an alt text. And basically, the reason why I did it is because if we had an audience member with a visual impairment who uses a screen reader to review materials, that tells them what the or that describes for them what the image is, and that helps them provide more context as to why an image is on the slide. And it's an element of universally designing our presentations that I started implementing after working with a client who asked me to design my slides that way for an education conference I spoke at recently, and I've been implementing that into all my presentations since then because I think it's just another way that we can make our presentations more accessible to and usable by all people. And so, yeah.
Yeah, usable by all people, wanting to make sure that it's not just something you think about afterwards, but something that's proactive. I love that you said that earlier. You said being proactive is thinking about what people need before they need it. I'm curious to know how you believe that our world would be different if we were even just 5 to 10% more proactive when it comes to DEIB work.
I think if we start to move the needle toward being proactive, it would help to um, eliminate some of the anxiety that we feel when people with a different ability want to engage in our organizations, because often the default system is to offer a reasonable accommodation, and then you have to evaluate the resources that you have and determine if the reasonable accommodation can be offered. So if we're more proactive, it helps to eliminate anxiety or decrease anxiety in the relational system, and to be able to focus more on building relationships with the people we serve by asking them first what they need, and then being flexible in the design of our organizational systems allows people to really gain access to the resources they need without having to go through so much red tape in order to access the resources. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think, yeah, keeping all these things in mind is just one step forward, right? We're just, how can I take one step forward towards this instead of thinking about, I have to change everything all at once, but thinking, what is one thing I can do practically to help move this forward? I think too, a lot of the people here, are leaders in their organization or their fields of influence. And the reason why they're here today is because they want to do something to move the needle forward. So if I'm guessing that they probably want practical tips too. So I'm curious to know, what would you say, Mason, is kind of those first few steps that our listeners today could take away from your talk?
So I think some of the first steps is to really, as a leader, I find it really important to be able to just sit and observe what's happening within my organizations, because through observation we gain insight into how people are behaving and interacting within our environment. So even taking just a cup of coffee and just sitting down and watching what people are doing within your environment, that can help you to begin to see potential barriers. But then the next step is to start to ask for feedback and gain insight into people's experiences. But like I said earlier, a practical first step that you can do as soon as you leave today is to share with people in your network what you took away from my talk, and then that just helps to create momentum that you can build upon in your future endeavors. So yeah.
I just put those 3 things in the chat. I think, yeah, to summarize, Mason, kind of what you said is to first observe and just notice what people are experiencing, and then ask them directly, what are you experiencing? What's it like here for you? And then 3, sharing what you took away from this event with the people around you in your social media networks, in your classrooms. thinking about how you can integrate and make your places more inclusive. I think too, what's interesting, Mason, that you said about asking for feedback is, and when we ask from every single individual who we have influence with, we might find out that there are unseen disabilities that are present in our organizations. And so that can even be something that can move us forward too, and continue to make our workplaces more inclusive. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. And so I'd love to open it up to Q&A. So if you haven't already, please drop your questions in the chat. And I'll go through a couple of the ones that we already have first while we wait for those to continue trickling in. But Mason, it looks like we have a question here that says, this has been fantastic from the beginning. Thank you. If you're open to it, can you share the challenges you experience when systems are not universally designed? What do roadblocks to resolution look like?
That's a fantastic question. So I would say that one of the roadblocks that I faced in my own life, and based upon my own experiences, is oftentimes we only focus on making our built environment accessible, but we really also have to look at making our policies and procedures that guide our organizations universally designed as well. Because if we only make the built environment accessible to people with disabilities, but there are still barriers with the policies and procedures, then people with certain disabilities will still be excluded, and it may not be exclusion in terms of discrimination, but even just like the exclusion doesn't qualify as discrimination. But if we don't make our policies universally designed as well, it really can be just as isolating as barriers in the built environment. And one of the examples, just briefly, is back in 2019, I was in my dorm and the fire alarm went off, and I had to stay in my bed because the place where I attended higher education did not want to accept the liability of having the RA or the RD assist with evacuation. And so the result of that, even after advocating for myself, was I telecommuted to campus via Zoom. And so that's one example of how there can often be a disconnect between universal design in the built environment and universal design from a policy and procedure standpoint. So yeah.
Yeah, Mason, I think that's so brave that you advocated for yourself. And I think the hope here is too that by changing policies and procedures and making them more inclusive, people will be advocated for in a way that maybe if they don't feel comfortable being brave like you were, or that's not something that they feel like they can do at that moment, that they still get what they need. So I think that's very brave of you, and I commend you greatly on that. And also for, it sounds like you're speaking up and being a voice for the people who can't be doing that for themselves, and that's amazing. We have another question here. I'll put it in the chat for everybody. What is the correct terminology for a person with a disability? Are they impaired, disabled, or does it matter? What's the difference?
That's a good question. So I would say I would focus on the person first language, like person with a disability, as you indicated in your question. I like to say, rather than impaired or handicapped, I would say something along the lines of a mobility issue, because a mobility issue is more it's more targeted toward what the actual issue is, and I think it's more inclusive. But like I said earlier in my talk, it's really important to talk to other people with disabilities within your network, because everyone's opinion and experience is different. But I would say that person first language is a key.
Yeah, that's great. Bringing it again back to the person first language um, is great. And just looking at, instead of seeing everybody as this lump sum of a category, thinking about them first as individuals, and that's what person first language really highlights. We have another question coming in. This one says, my cousin is blind and I have seen the challenges he faced and overcame. Does Mason feel that we are doing all we can to accommodate the blind in the workplace and in education? What is one thing he feels we can do better to accommodate the blind?
So I would say one of the key things for to better accommodate people who are blind or people with visual impairments is to make sure our course materials and other materials, such as menus within restaurants, are available in an alternative form, because it's really important for people with visual impairments and people with disabilities in general to have a level of autonomy. And if people with visual impairments do not have access to um, course materials or other materials that are in Braille, then they have to rely on someone else to help them to access the environment. So I think looking at ways to um, give people with visual impairments autonomy is really important, and Braille materials is one way to support their autonomy.
Hmm. Yeah, what would you say to someone who feels like they're uncomfortable to ask questions about disability and how to make the workplace more inclusive?
So one of the key things I would say in response to that is asking questions is one of the key vehicles um, to better understanding and to connection. And so if we don't figure out ways to ask questions, then the opportunity for connection and to be an ally of people with disabilities, it's much harder. But I do recognize that asking questions can be difficult. And so I would try to look at starting a conversation with someone with a disability around something that's not their disability. And then as you become more comfortable relationally, then you can dive deeper into their life experiences and the barriers that they face. So if you're not comfortable asking questions, I think asking questions that are not about someone's disability at first can really be an icebreaker that makes establishing the connection with that person more easy.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Mason, what has been the most meaningful connection or conversation you've had with someone surrounding your disability that would be great for people here to know?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm gonna take a second to think about that.
Yeah, no worries.
So I would say that one of the most impactful interactions is when someone sees me as a human being, and someone sees me as just like them, because we all have what I've coined specialized challenges. And initially the idea of specialized challenges came out of the fact that I wasn't I didn't like the term disability, but now I'm fine with the term disability. But the term specialized challenges really acknowledges the fact that we all have challenges or growth opportunities in our lives. And yes, one of mine is cerebral palsy, but that's where the story begins. It's not where it ends. So I think the interactions that that see my disability as an aspect of my identity, but not a defining characteristic of the way we interact, is are the most meaningful type of interactions.
Yeah, thank you, Mason, for sharing. I think that's absolutely true. And when we focus on people first and connection and what aspects of how we want to belong to a place or space is what changes, that's what changes the game and what makes us all be able to connect to each other. So again, thank you so much for sharing the things that you're passionate about, Mason, and your areas of expertise and research. It was such a joy to be able to moderate this fireside chat today. And I hope that you all as listeners have taken away some great points and action points to move forward. And Mason, I'd love to give you a chance. Is there anything you'd want to say to conclude with the audience today?
So just in conclusion, I would say thank you for your attention, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to recognize that disability is an important aspect of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And if there is any way that I can serve you or your organization, I would love to connect with you. My website is masonmetzger.com. On my website, you'll find my social media and ways to get into contact with me. And I hope you all have a peaceful and joy filled rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mason. We've got some links here in the chat for you all as well, with Mason's social media, ways to connect with him. He also has a website, as he mentioned, and a podcast, which that's something new that I learned today. I didn't know you had a podcast, so I will be tuning into that. Follow him on LinkedIn, and connect whenever you have questions. If there's anything that I know about Mason, it's that he's incredibly generous with his knowledge and his passion and expertise. So again, thank you so much for being here today, Mason. I do want to let you all know about a couple CWL events that we have to continue the theme of equitable connections across differences. This month, we actually have Dr. Joel joining us for a talk on a rear view mirror down the road. And he's going to speak about biases and making connections there for everybody. And then we'll have a community chat for Lifting Our Voices, which is a UAGC club here on the last Thursday of the month. So there are lots more things to tune into. We've got our newsletter coming out as well. And as always, feel free to connect with Dr. Resendez or I if you want to partner with us in any way at the CWL. This will be recorded and is going to be posted on our YouTube. So if you would like to continue watching or sharing with anybody that you think would be interested in what was shared today, please do, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone.